There are moments in life that the cameras never catch. Moments that happen in the stillness between grief and acceptance, in the quiet space where public personas dissolve and only raw human truth remains. When Tina Turner passed away on May 24, 2023, at her lakeside home in Kuznect, Switzerland, the world came to a standstill. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Social media flooded with tears and tributes. World leaders, rock legends, and ordinary fans alike paused to mourn the woman who had become so much more than a musician. She had become a symbol of what it means to rise from the ashes and refuse to be defined by your wounds. The tributes poured in for weeks. Her greatest hits reclaimed the top of the charts. Clips of her legendary performances circulated endlessly, the explosive energy, the thundering voice, the legs that seemed to defy time itself. Everyone had something to say about Tina Turner. Everyone, that is, except the one man who had been closest to her during the final and most peaceful chapter of her life. Erwin Bach, the quiet, reserved German music executive who had loved Tina Turner for nearly 4 decades, said nothing publicly in the immediate aftermath. While the world spoke for her, over her, and about her, Erwin remained silent. And in that silence, curiosity grew. What was he holding on to? What did he know about the woman behind the legend that the rest of the world had never been allowed to see? When he finally chose to speak, what he revealed was not what anyone expected. It was not a tribute rehearsed for cameras. It was not a carefully worded press statement. It was something far more personal, far more intimate, and it left even her most devoted fans quietly overwhelmed. To understand the weight of Erwin Bach's silence, and the significance of breaking it, you first have to understand who he is and what he represented in Tina Turner's life. Their story began in 1985, at an airport in Düsseldorf, Germany. Erwin, then a young music executive working for EMI, had been assigned the professional task of welcoming Tina to the city as part of her European tour arrangements. It was, by all outward appearances, an utterly ordinary business encounter. He was 30 years old. She was 46, freshly reinvented following the global explosion of her Private Dancer album, and entirely guarded when it came to matters of the heart. She had survived a marriage that nearly destroyed her. She had rebuilt herself from nothing. The last thing on her mind was falling in love. And yet, something happened in that airport. In her own words, her heart began to race when she saw him. She didn't act on it. Years of trauma had taught her to distrust her instincts when it came to men, but the feeling was undeniable. What followed was not a whirlwind romance. It was something slower, something quieter, and ultimately something far more durable. A friendship that deepened over months and years into genuine trust. A bond built not on passion alone, but on consistency, patience, and emotional safety, 3 things Tina Turner had rarely experienced from a romantic partner. For 27 years, they lived together without marrying. Some questioned this. Some speculated. But those who knew Tina understood. She had been trapped in a legal and emotional cage once before. She was not in a rush to sign another contract with anyone. When she finally agreed to marry Erwin in July 2013, in an intimate ceremony at their estate on the shores of Lake Zurich, it was because she was certain. Not because of societal expectation. Not because of public pressure. Because she knew, in the deep and unshakable way that only someone who has been truly broken can know, that this man was different. The guests at that wedding included Oprah Winfrey and Bryan Adams, but the real story was not the celebrity attendance. The real story was 2 people who had chosen each other, quietly and without performance, for the better part of 3 decades. And then came 2017, when the full depth of Erwin Bach's love was revealed in a way no ceremony ever could. Tina had been struggling with her health for years. She had suffered a stroke in 2013, was diagnosed with intestinal cancer, and was battling kidney failure, a cruel complication, in part, of a decision she had made years earlier to stop taking prescribed blood pressure medication in favor of homeopathic alternatives she felt more aligned with her Buddhist spiritual practices. By 2017, her kidneys had failed to the point where she faced a devastating choice: begin dialysis, which she deeply dreaded, or find a donor. She had, by her own admission, quietly accepted the possibility of death. She had made her peace with it. She was not afraid. Erwin Bach would not accept it. Without hesitation, without drama, and without asking for recognition, he was tested and found to be a compatible donor. He gave her one of his kidneys. He gave her years of lake walks and morning light and the Swiss mountain air she had come to love. In her memoir, My Love Story, published in 2018, Tina described this act not as heroic but as characteristic. That was simply who Erwin was, she wrote. He gave love the way most people breathe, naturally, without thinking, without conditions. This is the man who went silent after her death. This is the man the world was waiting to hear from. Grief is not a performance. For people who have loved deeply and lost genuinely, the early weeks and months after a death are not a time for public statements. They are a time for sitting with the unbearable reality of an absence that the mind cannot yet fully process. A chair at the table. A side of the bed that no longer moves. A voice you expect to hear around a corner that never comes. Erwin Bach, by every account, was not a man who sought the spotlight. Throughout his decades with Tina, he had deliberately positioned himself in the background. He was not her manager, not her producer, not her business partner in any formal sense. He was her home. And when the home loses the person it was built around, it does not immediately open its doors to strangers with microphones and questions. His silence was, in that sense, one of the most honest things he could have offered. It said, without words, that what he and Tina had shared could not be quickly condensed into a soundbite. That her death was not a PR moment. That he was not grieving for the cameras. But silence, when maintained in the face of an entire world demanding to hear from you, eventually becomes its own kind of statement. And as the tributes faded, as the documentaries cycled through their theatrical runs, as the Broadway musical continued drawing sold-out crowds, the absence of Erwin's voice became increasingly conspicuous. The world had heard from industry colleagues, childhood acquaintances, journalists who had interviewed her once decades ago. And still, the man who had held her hand through kidney surgery, through her mother's death, through strokes and cancer diagnoses and the quiet terror of her final years, he had not yet spoken. When he did, it was not on a talk show. It was not timed to coincide with an album release or a film premiere. It came in the form of deeply personal reflections shared with those closest to him, eventually making their way into written tributes and authorized interviews that he carefully chose and controlled. What he shared was not a performance of grief. It was a testimony to a love story that had, in many ways, gone underseen even while it was happening right in front of the world. What Erwin Bach shared, when he finally opened up, centered not on Tina Turner the icon, but on Tina Turner the woman, and the distinction was everything. He spoke about the Tina that the public rarely saw. The woman who, despite decades of global fame, remained deeply private about her inner world. Who laughed easily and fully in the mornings over coffee. Who had a dry sense of humor that caught people off guard. Who cried at small things, a piece of music, a memory, the particular quality of afternoon light on the lake. Who was, despite the mythology built around her, genuinely humble about her own significance. She did not sit around marveling at her legacy, he indicated. She sat around enjoying her garden and her peace and the company of the people she loved. He spoke about her relationship with faith. Tina's Buddhism was not a pose or a branding strategy, it was the architecture of her daily life. The chanting, the stillness, the deliberate practice of returning to the present moment, these were not occasional rituals but constant companions. Erwin shared that in her final years, as her health declined, she leaned into her spiritual practice with even greater depth and consistency. She had, he suggested, arrived at a place of genuine acceptance about death, not resignation, but genuine peace. She was not afraid of dying. She was grateful for having lived so fully, so completely, and so freely after so many years of living in fear. He also spoke, and this is where many people found themselves unexpectedly emotional, about how Tina had finally, truly forgiven herself. 4 years, one of the quieter threads running through Tina's public reflections had been a subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of self-questioning. Why had she stayed so long? Why had she not left Ike sooner? Why had the girl who became such a powerful woman taken so many years to find her power? These were questions she had addressed publicly on many occasions, but there was always a sense that the answers she offered were partly for the audience, not entirely from the deepest place inside her. Erwin revealed that in the privacy of their home, in the years before her death, Tina had worked through those questions in ways that were not visible to the public. That she had arrived, through Buddhism and through honest self-examination, at a place where she no longer blamed herself for what had been done to her. That she understood, in the full and unqualified way that healing sometimes makes possible, that the girl who had been abandoned by both parents before the age of 12 and left in the care of strict grandparents in rural Tennessee had done the only thing she knew how to do to survive. That she had not been weak. She had been human. And that distinction, finally internalized, had brought her a freedom she described to Erwin as the greatest gift of her later life. Greater, even, than the Grammys, the sold-out stadiums, the adoration of millions. But there was something else Erwin shared that no one had anticipated. Something that reframed the final chapter of Tina Turner's life in a way that surprised even her longest-standing admirers. He revealed that in her final years, Tina had been working on something deeply personal, a project that was never intended for public release, never designed to extend her brand or cement her legacy. It was a collection of private writings, reflections, letters, memories, and meditations that she had been quietly accumulating over years. Not a memoir in any commercial sense, but something more intimate, a record she was keeping for herself and for the people she loved. A way of holding on to what mattered. A way of making sense of a life that, even to her, sometimes felt almost impossibly large. Some of these writings, Irwin revealed, were addressed to people who were no longer living. To her son Ronnie, who had died in 2022 after a struggle with colon cancer, a loss that had devastated her in ways she tried to shield from public view. She had outlived her child, and no amount of spiritual preparation or Buddhist practice fully insulates a mother from that particular grief. She wrote to him. She kept writing to him after he was gone. Some were addressed to the girl she had been. To Anna Mae Bullock, the daughter left behind by both parents, picking cotton in Nutbush, Tennessee, with no idea that the world would one day know her name. Tina had written to that girl with what Irwin described as extraordinary tenderness and compassion. She had told her that she was enough. That she had always been enough. That everything that came after, the pain, the fame, the abuse, the redemption, had never changed the essential worth of who she was from the very beginning. This revelation, more than any tribute or documentary, seemed to crystallize something for the people who heard it. Because Tina Turner had spent her public life being defined by what she had overcome. She had been framed, almost inescapably, through the lens of her trauma. Even the most loving tributes tended to emphasize her suffering as the source of her strength, as though she could only be celebrated as a survivor, rather than simply as a woman who had lived with extraordinary fullness and complexity. What Irwin was describing was different. He was describing a woman who, in the end, had found a way to love herself not because of what she had survived, but in spite of the fact that she had needed to survive anything at all. A woman who had come to see her own life not as a story of